Mercedes looked very good on Friday afternoon in Miami, very good going into qualifying for the sprint race, and duly took the pole. We've been saying all year that there are going to be teams that get it more or less right in terms of use of the tyres from one race to the next. It's going to be the McLaren team and maybe Red Bull, Max Verstappen, that have the common consistency through most of the races. But here, Mercedes looked really strong, and they duly got the pole. Except that it wasn't George Russell. It was Kimi Antonelli, 18 years old, who recorded a 26.4 in this, his first season of Formula One, to take the pole for the sprint race. Beautiful lap it was to watch too. I've been saying all year how good he is on slow corners. He is a short corner driver. He looks wonderful. I've always said there's a little bit of ground that he can make up on medium and high speed corners. I think that's probably still the case. But here at Miami, plenty of corners where he can show his talent, show off his talent, I think you could say, because he looked really polished and really glossy. I think the most demanding, most interesting corner in Miami is turn 7. It's the left-hander after that very quick run after the start-finish line. They go through a right-hander and then some quick S's, and they're accelerating most of the time. Some quick corners there, more or less line-locked, although Charles Leclerc, of course, would disagree with that. He had a couple of offs there in the past in the Ferrari. But as they're going into turn 7, they're braking down into 4th gear from 7th gear. And the car's got load on it. It's got lateral load. So it's an interesting corner. And here Kimi was really out-Landoing Lando. He just looked fabulous. He came in braking hard in 4th. And then unlike virtually everybody out there, was doing what Lando normally does and just coming out of the throttle, coming out of the brakes. He's going a little bit too quickly, getting the weight transfer sorted, no throttle, no brakes, getting the car settled, and then squeezing on the power. There wasn't an abrupt arrival of throttle either. Everything was very patient, very controlled, looking like a Max Verstappen when he's got lots and lots of grip. Just wonderful to watch through there. Lando was doing the same thing, but of course he was doing it from a slightly wider approach, and he wasn't doing it with the same management of the brake and throttle against steering, because Kimi already at this young age is turning in much earlier than Lando and creating a short corner going in and waiting for that rotation point, just as I say, as Max Verstappen does. It's not happening quite as much on fast and medium speed corners, but that isn't a major penalty for him around Miami. Yes, there are some fast kinks, there are some fast corners, but it's all about just keeping the car on a ribbon more than anything else, and he's very, very good at that. Sector 2 is kind of built for Kimi Antonelli. It's all slow corners. Yeah, there's some high-speed braking at the end of the long straight, but then it's all slow-speed corners going in and out. Really, really quick there. Sector 3, Mercedes always been very good in a straight line, and they are indeed at Miami. So it's just the high-speed braking into that last corner. And again, he's got some nice slowish corners to take him through to the start-finish line. So really, really good lap. The structure of his qualifying, of course, explains quite a lot, because he went out towards the end, as I say, or right at the end, as I say, when the track was at its quickest, when the track was at its most crowded as well. Whereas his teammate, George Russell, the driver you would imagine would be taking the pole, Mercedes being this good this weekend, like Max Verstappen, who actually was first on track in SQ1 and SQ2. That was Max's philosophy today, just get out there when there's no traffic. George did the same at the beginning of SQ3 when they went from mediums to soft tyres. So we're all on soft tyres for the first time. And indeed, on that first run, on a clear track, George Russell did a 26.7, 0.3 quicker than Max Verstappen, who was only actually a 10th quicker on the softs than he had been on the medium. So he didn't get in a good lap. George then came in and then sat out the rest of the session. He just did that one run, assuming, I guess, having a clear track would be even more important than getting the track at its best and possibly having some traffic. But it didn't work out for him, because not only Kimi, but both McLarens and Max went quicker. Max, yes, he stayed out on that set of soft tyres, the only driver to get 2 laps out of them. He was quickest in Sector 1 on that second lap, but of course the tyres then went away, and by the time he got to Sector 3, he'd lost some of that advantage, but he still out-qualified George Russell, which will have, I guess that will have really irritated George. Not only that his teammate, Kimi, is on the pole, but also that Max got him right at the end as well, and George probably could have stayed out. Maybe it was a fuel thing, I don't know. We've seen that before at Mercedes. So he has to live now that on a weekend where the Mercedes quite clearly is a really quick car, a Grand Prix winning car for sure, it's Kimi Antonelli on the pole for the sprint race. I'm sure George has got other ideas already going into the Grand Prix, but Kimi Antonelli could very easily win the sprint from the pole tomorrow. I was actually asked on a live stream on Tuesday, one of the viewers asked if I thought any of the rookies could win a sprint race this year. And I said, yeah, absolutely, for sure. Kimi Antonelli can win one. And we may well see that win happening tomorrow. Oscar Piastri alongside him, Lando Norris right behind him. The McLaren, a very, very quick car, looks really good for the Grand Prix proper in terms of the full race distance, how it's managing its tyres, how good it was when they put a bit of fuel in the car at the end of the afternoon session. The first session, the only untimed session we had in Miami. Lando looking good, Oscar looking good, because neither of them create short corners in the way that Kimi Antonelli does. Yes, they have the touch, yes, they have the feel, and Oscar certainly at the beginning of last year was driving a little bit like Kimi right now, but then Oscar's come away from that, and it'll be interesting now to see whether, as a result of what Kimi's done, whether Oscar might be rethinking about what he does do going into some of the slow circuits coming up now, because he does have the talent to do that. He's just not doing it, because I guess at the moment his yardstick is Lando Norris and what Lando is doing, and he's just got to stay with him or maybe just slightly ahead of him, which again he's done today. And so as it played out, Oscar slightly quicker than Lando through sector 1, through the change of direction, not asking quite as much of the car as Lando. Sector 2, Oscar slightly quicker again, but sector 3, Lando had a little bit more in his tyres and was quickest in sector 3. So very, very even between the two McLaren drivers. Meanwhile, Max Verstappen, as I say, quickest in sector 1 on that second run, but by the time he got to sector 2, sector 3, of course, that tyre on its second lap had lost its edge. So he will start fourth behind Antonelli and the two McLarens. George Russell will be a disgruntled fifth, I would say. Not happy about that at all, but he'll be thinking already of the Grand Prix. And then came the two Ferraris, Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton. Ferrari looking for a lot more this weekend already. It's a cliche to say that, but after Saudi Arabia, Ferrari definitely felt that they had a good race car now, and it was just going to be small detail improvements, and they're always going to be there or thereabouts. But today, not in the same class as Mercedes, that's for sure. Now, possibly we can write that off as we have been a little bit with the cars just below McLaren and Red Bull, saying that on any given weekend, one of them is going to get the tyres absolutely right. And maybe this is one weekend where the softness of the range of the Pirellis isn't suiting the Ferrari. But at the moment, a long way away from Mercedes, and that'll be a worry for them. But Charles Leclerc, again, quicker than Lewis Hamilton. Quick word about the Ferraris. Not sure about their livery. Basically red from the nose up to the back of the cockpit, and then blue and white. Last year, they looked really nice. They came to Miami, and this is an HP thing, I believe. They came to Miami, and they had blue against the red. Now they put a dividing line down the middle of the car, red and then blue and white, and it looks a real dog's dinner in my opinion. Don't know why they've done that. What they should have done, I think, if I may suggest, is just do a blue and white car for Miami. And the precedent was there, of course, because that's how the Ferraris raced in 1964 when John Surtees won the World Championship in North America, in Mexico and the United States. They ran in blue and white, and the Ferrari would look absolutely superb in blue and white, just as the drivers do at the moment in their blue and white overalls. So I don't know why they didn't do that. Anyway, 8th and 9th, Alex Albon in the Williams, Isaac Hadjar in the Red Bull B car. Really good performance from both of those drivers. Carlos Sainz in the other Williams is in a really good lap, but locked up under high-speed braking in SQ2. Great shame for Carlos, because he would have been right up there as well, but sort of classic Carlos Sainz in a way. And Fernando Alonso, very good job in what is obviously an unbelievably slow Aston Martin P10. And he was quick on medium tyres too in SQ2. So Fernando definitely hasn't lost it, enjoying the Miami weekend so far. Shout out to Nico Hülkenberg. Very good job to be P11 in the Sauber. Went very well by Sauber terms anyway. Nico Hülkenberg. Esteban Ocon also not bad in the Haas Ferrari, P12, and Pierre Gasly 13th in the Alpine Renault. But the big talk, of course, is about Kimi Antonelli taking the pole for the sprint race. This is even more amazing than Lewis Hamilton taking the pole for the sprint race in China. And look what happened there. Yeah, he could well do it tomorrow. Kimi could win a, how do we word this, a point-scoring round of the Formula One World Championship. Not a Grand Prix, of course, but if he does that, he will, of course, be the youngest driver ever to do so. So congratulations to him. Before we go, a quick word about these stunning 3 REC watches, the faces of which have been designed in the theme of 3 amazing Ford GT40 teams, race teams from the 1960s, namely Shelby American, Essex Wire, and Sid Taylor Racing. Denny Hulme drove and won races with Sid Taylor Racing in that GT40. And these 3 watches, all in the colours of those race teams, and all 3 watches contain original materials from the GT40s raced at that time. Details in the description below. And if you quote Peter GT40, you'll get an additional 20% discount, so don't miss out on that. A big thanks, of course, then to REC Watches, to OEM Exclusive, to Track Ninja, and to Jetcraft for their support of this channel. And let's see what happens tomorrow. Can Kimi Antonelli win his first Formula One race? Well, if you wanted a case study of how a racing driver can put together a lap in a slightly inferior car and get the pole, then we saw it this afternoon in Miami. A brilliant pole lap by Max Verstappen. I thought it's getting to be very difficult to rate Max's pole laps over the years, but this has definitely got to be up there in my opinion. And I never thought I'd be saying that about Miami because I've always sort of pigeonholed it as a bit of a sort of boring street circuit. But no, what a lap by Max, and the way he put it together. Bearing in mind the Red Bull clearly doesn't have the same inherent efficient downforce as the McLaren for whatever reason. And the McLaren was always going to be very good in Sector 2 where there are lots of corners involving turn-in and traction, where the McLaren drivers basically just had to do a nice clean job in order to sustain an advantage there. Max had to find the advantage in Sectors 1 and 3. Sector 3 is a long straight basically with a high-speed braking area at the end of it. So the key thing there for him was to be very clean and to do what he was doing in Saudi Arabia, just getting in beautifully quite early, the way he's coming out of the brakes, the way he is patiently waiting for the throttle. And so in many ways, the heart of the lap was in Sector 1. In that section of road I talked about yesterday, going down towards Turn 7. And as Q1 turned into Q2, turned into Q3, and Max, alone with the two McLaren drivers and Charles Leclerc, was sparingly using the softs and not using too many just to have to do a time in Q1 and Q2, like, say, George Russell or Lewis Hamilton. And he had two really good laps. He just went quicker and quicker and quicker and perfected his use of short corners and the way he was using the throttle and brakes, particularly into Turn 7, giving the most unbelievable run on the straight there that followed. And that was it. After that, the McLaren drivers, who neither of them have the touch and feel of Max Verstappen, nor the ability to use short corners to shorten the corner the way Max was, particularly in Turn 7, found they were having to take more risk with late braking, getting on the power a little bit earlier, maybe clipping apices a little bit tighter in order to try to make back the time. And that's what we saw Lando Norris doing on his fastest lap. It was quite interesting, actually. When they stopped at the end of phase 1 of Q3, both Max and Lando done a 26.4. And I have to say, I thought that was the absolute limit of the Red Bull. I never imagined he would be able to go any quicker than that. And I thought Lando was going to get the pole. And sure enough, Lando did 26.2. But that 26.2 was a blemished 26.2. In reality, I think that McLaren could have done a 26.1, 26.0, but we didn't see it from either driver. And what happened with Lando is that he got slightly squirrely as he turned in from high-speed braking at the end of Sector 3 and clunked over the apex curve just to get the car hooked in. It was uncomfortable. He lost a tenth or two there, maybe less than that, but that was enough to give Max the pole. And as for Oscar, yeah, just a little bit too much aggression with the throttle compared with Lando, particularly on the slow acceleration runs, running a little bit nearer the wall, perhaps on a little bit of road where there was some marbles, and that cost him a little bit as well. Very, very close between the two, but neither of them in the class of Max Verstappen today. Just an unbelievable lap by Max to take the pole. And all this to the background of a sprint race that happened earlier in the day in the wet. Charles Leclerc didn't even start the race. He went off on the formation lap, aquaplaned off at high speed, damaged the Ferrari, didn't race at all. The start was then delayed about 40 minutes. And then when they did start the race, it was Oscar Piastri from Lando Norris, because Kimi Antonelli's pole disappeared a little bit like Max Verstappen in Saudi Arabia at the first corner, with Oscar Piastri making a really good start on the dirty side of the grid. Of course, it didn't really matter because the track was greasy. They were all on intermediate tyres. And he's alongside Antonelli going into that corner on the inside. And Antonelli ran wide off the track and dropped 2 or 3 positions. Came back just in front of George Russell. Drove really well, actually. A lot of pressure from George. George on the radio saying, I've got the pace, I've got the pace. But Antonelli just stuck with it. Really, really good. But then fell out of any point-scoring position with an incident in the pit lane when... I don't know what's going on at Red Bull. The pit work at Red Bull definitely needs to be tighter and sharper. Is it since Jonathan Wheatley left? Anyway, rhetorical question probably. They released Max too early, right in the path of Antonelli. Right rear, took off the left front end plate of Max's Red Bull. Max got a 10-second penalty. But Excellent reflexes from Kimi Antonelli. Then, having done that, he just aborted his pit stop, went straight down the pit lane and had to come in the following lap, which dropped him out of the points. But really, really nice bit of driving by Antonelli and thinking as well. Very impressive to see that. And then Fernando Alonso tangled with Liam Lawson. That brought out the safety car. Oscar Piastri had already stopped for his slicks. Lando Norris effectively timed it perfectly and inherited the win. McLaren won too, with Lewis Hamilton third in the Ferrari. He'd stopped amongst the earliest to come in for dry tyres and benefited from that. Very good drive by Lewis. Well, confidence building drive, shall we say. And we all had great hopes for him as we went into qualifying. But as it was pretty much the same. Didn't get out of Q2. Charles Leclerc did. Wasn't very quick in the Ferrari, got to say. The Ferrari's definitely struggling to get the tyres to work. But Lewis Hamilton didn't even make it out of Q2. So another very disappointing day for Lewis. So it was Max Verstappen on this amazing pole. Lando Norris second. But third, Kimi Antonelli on the last lap, continuing what we saw yesterday, what we saw effectively in the sprint race, and now looking really good in the dry in the Mercedes. P3 upstaging George Russell, who was struggling most of the qualifying session to get the tyres to work. He complained several times on the radio about lack of grip. Nothing from Antonelli, just out there doing the lap time and shorter corners than George Russell. And it really does add up around Miami. As I said yesterday, really, really nice to watch Antonelli at work today. So it's Oscar Piastri fourth. George Russell eventually qualified fifth. Carlos Sainz sixth. Very good job in the Williams, just ahead of Alex Albon. Both Williams Mercedes, very impressive throughout the 2 days in Miami, although Carlos Sainz was making up time in the sprint race from the back of the grid, but then managed to hit an apex a little bit too closely and damage the Williams on that one. Esteban Ocon, very good job to get into the top 10, qualified ninth in the Haas Ferrari, and Yuki Tsunoda did get into Q3, but he will start 10th in the other Red Bull. I think more than anything, it's just showing how good Max's lap was. Again, Yuki Tsunoda 26.9 on a new set of softs. Max Verstappen 26.2. I mean, that is a lot around one lap of Miami. It just shows what Max is doing with the car these days. Isaac Hadjar, P11, just failed to make it. It was incredibly close. If you look at the drivers that didn't make it into Q3, well, if we start with Charles Leclerc, who qualified 8th in Q2, did a 26.9. Yuki Tsunoda 26.9, so he was P9. Esteban Ocon, the last to get through to Q3, did a 26.9. And then those that didn't get through, Isaac Hadjar, 26.9. Lewis Hamilton, 27.0. Gabriele Bortoletto, 27.1. Good job by him in the Sauber. Very good job. Jack Doohan also did a good job, 27.1. And Liam Lawson, 27.3. Jack Doohan got into Q2. Pierre Gasly had a lot of traffic, did not. And Liam Lawson complaining a lot about battery issues as well on that car. So yeah, the McLaren does look to be the better race car compared with the Red Bull going into Sunday. The weather's a little bit of a question mark as well. I think the wet caught some teams by surprise. And it was, I don't know, I've got mixed feelings about it. You might say that sprint race was dramatic, lots of incidents, lots going on. At the same time, if it wasn't a sprint weekend or sprint racing had never been invented, just a practice session, certainly the Williams, Aston Martin and Ferrari mechanics wouldn't have had to have put in the hours that they did afterwards rebuilding those damaged cars. Anyway, I guess the fans would have loved it, and that's what sprint racing is all about, lots of incidents. And everybody looking forward now, of course, to tomorrow. I think from Max Verstappen's point of view, he's hoping it's going to be wet, hoping it's going to be cool. What he doesn't want is hot track temperatures, as we saw on Friday in FP1 or in practice 1, because for sure the Red Bull will be tougher on its tyres than the two McLarens. His best chances if the temperatures are cooler. But even so, it's 2 against 1. It's 2 McLarens there. And it'll be interesting to see whether McLaren play around with strategies a little bit with their two drivers to see if they can take the race to Max, maybe get him to push the tyres harder than he wants. But Max, very, very good at controlling the race. And if you look at top speeds, he's not bad either on top speeds, definitely. He's got a top speed advantage over the McLarens. But of course, if they're in DRS range, that doesn't mean anything at all going into the race tomorrow. So Max putting that Red Bull absolutely on the line, but not in an oversteery, almost hitting the wall sort of way. In an absolute example of the perfection of managing dynamic weight, I guess is the best way of describing it. It's quite a complicated way of describing it, but that's what Max was doing. And how he found all that time in that section, particularly going into turn 7, just phenomenal. It doesn't show up on telemetry. It's all about the combination of the steering that he's giving the car at any given moment, the release of the brake pedal pressure, and of how long he's waiting to get onto the power as well. And he's doing everything with perfect timing. And the rotation, of course, absolutely perfect as well. Case study, as I said at the beginning of this video, of how to do it. And as we close, a reminder that the amazing range of REC watches includes 3 that are very closely related in terms of DNA, actual materials from the cars, to 3 of the teams that ran successfully Ford GT40s in the mid-1960s. These teams are Shelby American, Essex Wire, and Sid Taylor Racing. Carroll Shelby was larger than life. He was an amazing racing driver, very short career, discovered quite early on when he was still in his 20s that he had a bit of a heart condition, and so he retired very early, only 6 years into his career. But as he retired, he had just won Le Mans in 1959 with Aston Martin. Roy Salvadori was the co-driver, giving Aston their first win at 10 attempts at trying at Le Mans. Brilliant achievement by Carroll. And then he went on to win the Tourist Trophy with Stirling Moss in the Aston as well. And then he basically called it quits. He did do a little bit of Formula One as well, actually finished 4th, classified 4th in the Italian Grand Prix in 58 at the wheel of a 250F Maserati. Then he went back to America, and his dream always was effectively to create a Ferrari for the Americans. In other words, a Ferrari that didn't have all the frills that you had to pay for in the United States. He wanted a strong, simple chassis around which he could fit American parts, running gear, engine, gearbox, etc. And of course, that became the Shelby Cobra. But because of his success at Le Mans, it was perfect timing for Carroll to go to the Ford Motor Company in early 1962 with the concept of the Cobra, of putting that engine in the Cobra. And because that was so successful, he was then a key part of the development of the Ford GT40, winning Le Mans, of course, in 1966 with Bruce McLaren and Chris Amon, and also crossing the line just behind them, should have been a dead heat finish, Ken Miles and Denny Hulme in the other car. So Carroll Shelby, a real hero, did most of his racing wearing bib overalls because he used to be a chicken farmer, and at one stage very early in his career back in the early 50s he was a little bit late getting to the track, so he stayed in his kit for the day, arrived dressed as a chicken farmer and won the race. And of course the fans loved it, the press loved it, and thereafter it became his trademark. He didn't always wear them, but he tried to do his best. He was very, very good with the media, very, very good with the fans, as was his 10-gallon cowboy hat as well. So Carroll Shelby, one of the icons, and effectively you can have a part of that history on your wrist with the Shelby American REC watch. The choice is yours, but details, as I say, in the description below this video. A big thanks to OEM Exclusive, to Track Ninja, and to Jetcraft. Looking forward to the race tomorrow. See you then. As good as the Miami Grand Prix was from time to time during the afternoon, I can't remember the last time there was a race in which the radio transmissions were actually better than the action on track. Of course, the Oscar, excuse the pun here, should go to Ferrari, who put on a great imitation of themselves. But honourable mentions should also go to Carlos Sainz of the Williams-Mercedes team and to Max Verstappen at Red Bull Honda. But first, the news. The news, of course, is that McLaren finished 1-2, a dominant win in the end, with a car that was, well, as we saw throughout the weekend, demonstrably quicker than anything else we saw at the Miami venue. But it wasn't easy for them because, as we saw yesterday, Max Verstappen took a brilliant pole position. As I said at the end of the video last night, Max's only real chance of winning the race on Sunday, bearing in mind the tiny sweet spot he has for operating the tyres on that car compared with the McLaren drivers, the only chance he was going to have would be if the weather intervened. And it tried hard. In the morning, there were plenty of warnings about thunderstorms coming up from the Gulf of Mexico. And in addition to that, the FIA put out, first time I've ever seen it, the procedure that Formula One should follow in the event of lightning. And I thought it was all going to be, if you're following another car and it gets struck by lightning, do this, or if you see some fork lightning there, make sure you go there because this is conductive, that isn't. But it wasn't any of that stuff. It was all about regulatory things to do in the garage and what changes you could make to the car in the pit lane or in the garage. All quite boring stuff, actually. But anyway, there they were thinking about thunderstorms, potential lightning, but none of that happened. There were 1 or 2 drops of rain, completely inconsequential. So Max Verstappen was basically faced with a dry race. Everybody except George Russell and Lewis Hamilton started on the medium tyre. It was a one-stop strategy, medium and then to hard. And Max on the pole made a pretty good start, but Lando Norris on his right, on the inside, made a very, very good start. As I said a few videos ago, who says Lando doesn't make great starts? So there he is down the inside, but I don't think it was that. I think Max just made his own mistake. He just outbraked himself, went a little bit too deep. Maybe the tyres weren't properly up to temperature. Again, probably easier to get the tyres into the sweet spot on the McLaren compared with the Red Bull. Max locked up, ran wide, and there's Lando down the inside, and it looked for all the world as if he was going to get the lead here. But the problem for Lando is that at Miami, yes, it's a relatively tight right-hander, but then you're accelerating out of that through a left-hander. And of course, even though he was on the outside of the right-hander, Max was lined up perfectly for the inside going into the left. And there was Lando now effectively on the outside, but alongside him. And all Max had to do was just back off a fraction and Lando would have got the lead. But Max Verstappen was never going to do that for Lando Norris. He just stayed on the racing line, used probably a little bit more road than he should have, knowing that Lando was there. And Lando had no alternative but to go off track and lose 2 or 3 places. And I think here, you know, a little bit like Max should have given the position back in Saudi Arabia, and we would have had a different evening there. I think in this occasion, it was pretty obvious that Max was going to do that. I don't think Lando read Max very well. And had he just backed off slightly there, let Max take that position, filed in behind him, Lando would still have been second. But much more importantly, he would have been in front of Oscar Piastri and he probably would have won the race. So easy to say, oh, well, Lando blew it there. But the reality is you've got to read the character of the individual that you're racing against. And as we saw later in the race, about 15, 20 laps later, when Lando was trying to get past Max now to get up to P2, he dropped 3 or 4 places. He got past the Williams, he got past the Mercedes very easily, and he quickly caught Max. But with the tyres now hot and the McLaren in much better shape than the Red Bull, Lando took too long to pass Max. Maybe it was because he was a bit daunted by what had happened out of that first corner, but I think it was more just Lando is a little bit messy, well, very messy when it comes to traffic. Oscar Piastri got past Max Verstappen, absolutely no problem, took him 2 laps, bang, he was gone. Actually, he induced Max into his second mistake of the race. The first was obviously at the first corner, and it was at that same corner with Oscar having got the DRS on the pit straight, 3 DRS zones in Miami. He was down the inside, and Max just braked a little bit too hard again, ran wide, and Oscar took the lead. Very, very simple. But Max made no mistakes. Obviously, when Lando Norris was behind him, he didn't feel the pressure. And at one point, Lando did get past at the second straight DRS, but then ran wide off track and had to give the position back to Max at the next straight, and then had to repass him. The whole thing was very messy. And by the time Lando got past Max to make it a McLaren 1-2, Oscar Piastri, and then Lando Norris, he was 9 seconds behind Oscar Piastri. So thank you and good night. Now, it's easy for me to say all of that because one other thing should be mentioned from the start of the race, and that is Kimi Antonelli. Just superb again. We saw how good he was on Friday. We saw how good he was yesterday. This guy's getting better and better all the time. So when this incident happened with Lando Norris, there's Kimi, bang, straight past him and pushing Max like crazy going down through turns 5, 6 and 7, almost getting the lead going into 7. But Max just held the position and then gradually pulled away from Kimi Antonelli. And Oscar Piastri had to work very hard for 2 or 3 laps to get past Kimi. Very impressive drive by Kimi Antonelli. Sadly, and I'm going to have to jump ahead now because it's quite a complicated race, but sadly for Kimi, it didn't pan out as well as it should have because Mercedes brought him in relatively early to try to get the undercut on Max Verstappen. Max responded the following lap, so it didn't pay off. He came out ahead of Antonelli. But that meant because of a virtual safety car, which was instigated a couple of laps later, George Russell had the benefit of a VSC to come in for his pit stop, and he easily got past Kimi that way. And then all of a sudden, he got past Max as well. So all of a sudden, it was George Russell up in P3. And Kimi Antonelli, in addition, had dropped behind Alex Albon in the Williams, a position he was never able to get back. So it didn't end that well for Kimi, but he will be able to leave Miami feeling incredibly confident and happy with the way things have gone. Anyway, back to the front of the race. Got to say, the McLaren MCL 39, just in a class of its own, basically a second a lap quicker than any other car out there. You know, obviously taking tyres into account, but on all levels of fuel, the McLaren was just the class car. More dominant in Miami than it's been at any race so far this year. And Oscar Piastri, just superb. Yes, Lando Norris set fastest lap and reduced that 9-second gap down to 4 seconds or something towards the end. But that was just Oscar looking after the tyres, looking after the fuel, looking after everything, just making sure that there were no issues. That was not Oscar Piastri on the limit by any means. And Lando Norris, of course, in finishing second, will think, well, not a bad weekend, the way things have been going. Recently, I won the sprint race, admittedly by default. I was quicker than Oscar in qualifying. I was on the front row, and had Max not taken me off or whatever, and Max didn't get the penalty. Obviously, Lando had been on the radio saying that Max had taken him out, pushed him off. Then he could have won that race. I think, as I say, I think he should have read what Max was going to do, and it's pretty clear what Max was going to do. He should have just backed off, given him the position, filed into P2, and then he would have won that race. There's no way Oscar Piastri would have beaten Lando Norris had Lando had track position. But that was it. The minute he was behind Oscar, it was all over. All the radio stuff really began with Max Verstappen's description of what it was like driving that Red Bull RB21 when he was fighting with Lando, fighting with Oscar. And he said it was just super slippery everywhere, which kind of, you can understand what he means by that. The thing was just sliding everywhere with no grip. But he didn't look like that on track, but that's obviously what he was feeling. And then he said, the brakes are terrible as well, which is a function, of course, of the tyres going off and general lack of grip anyway. Probably not the brakes per se. And so, again, everything that happened today puts the quality of Max's pole lap yesterday into its true perspective. Astounding that he got the pole in a Red Bull that was not as good as a Mercedes in the race, let alone as good as the two McLaren Mercedes. Just an outstanding qualifying lap, and Max Verstappen eventually finished fourth, unable to do anything about George, who was on the medium tyres at the end. Max is on the hard. The only hope then was that, because the rain wasn't going to come, the only hope was that the medium might go off towards the end. But they didn't. They did on Lewis Hamilton's Ferrari, but they didn't on George's car. He was in clean air the minute he had them. And he was able to look after them and drove beautifully. Max never even got within DRS range. But having said that, he always kept it within about 2.3 seconds. Sometimes it came down to about 1.2. But it was never, ever going to be on without DRS. And he never got in range of DRS. Towards the end of the race, there was another great radio bit when Red Bull said to Max, make sure you finish within 5 seconds of George. Now, earlier in the race, Max, when he was behind George, he'd said, George didn't slow for the yellow. Mate, report that, or something like that. And no doubt Red Bull did their best. And because no decision had been taken about anything to do with the yellow, and as I'm doing this video now, I haven't seen any talk yet. There may well be. Watch this space, I guess. But on the second last lap, they said to Max, don't back off, Max. Stay within 5 seconds of George, which is obviously Red Bull just quite good thinking, making sure that if George did get the penalty, that Max would then get P3. And Max replied, why do I have to do that? No, don't worry, Max. We'll talk about it after the race. You can see how excited he was on the radio. Anyway, let's move on to Ferrari, who were absolutely pathetic today. I don't know whether it's a function of how ugly their car looks in that livery, that HP livery. It's just terrible. I talked about it yesterday. I don't know why, but it looked even worse today. I don't know if it was the light or the angle of the sun or whatever it was, but the white wheels and the whole thing just looked absolutely horrendous. Don't know what they're thinking. If that's what you got to do to the car to keep your sponsor happy, probably better in Ferrari's case. They don't need the money anyway, do they? Probably not to have the sponsor, just have the red car. Anyway, it all started because they're on different strategies. And Charles, starting on the medium tyre, didn't have a great first part of the race. And Lewis was even worse on the hard tyre, so they were nowhere really. But when they switched tyres, Lewis suddenly on the medium tyre was catching Charles, and there was something like P6, P7 to fight for. It was going to be difficult for them to do anything about the Mercedes, either Mercedes or Alex Albon, let alone Max Verstappen. But nonetheless, Ferrari wanted to put on a good show. And so there's Lewis starts to catch Charles Leclerc, and he's catching him and gets on the radio and says, I'm getting held up now. My tyres are getting hot. Come on, what are we going to do, guys? And they say, we'll get back to you, Lewis. Nothing happens. Lewis says something like, you guys having tea or what? And eventually they tell Charles to let Lewis pass. And it takes a lap or two for Charles to sort of eventually do that begrudgingly. And then Charles comes out with the absolute classic, having let Lewis pass, and says, tell Lewis to go faster. My tyres are getting too hot. You can't please these guys, can you? You've got DRS if you're behind the guy, but if you're behind the guy, the tyres are going to get too hot. Anyway, so it went on. And of course, the problem then was that Lewis's tyres had got quite hot, and he wasn't that quick, having got past Charles. Very embarrassing situation for Lewis, really. He was going about as quick. No, he was about 0.3 slower than George everywhere. And not on track position, but just, that was when they were on free air, he couldn't get anywhere near George's lap times on the same tyre. Anyway, Charles then says towards the end of the race, how near are we to Kimi Antonelli? Because I'm getting held up now. I could maybe get Kimi. Ferrari then come back and say, okay, if you're in free air, Charles, how quickly do you think you can go? I mean, I've never heard a race engineer say that to a driver in the middle of a race. How quickly do you think you could go if you're in free air? Of course, Charles says, I have no idea, but let's give it a go. So they're going to tell Lewis to give position back to Charles. I'm smiling here because it was quite funny, really. I mean, you've got to say it was funny because we're not talking about the lead here. It was, 8th, 9th place they were doing. It was ridiculous. But I guess anyway, watching it, you could say, well, it's the Ferraris. They're stars of the show, whatever. So anyway, Lewis eventually moves past and gives Charles the position back again. And Charles says, right, let's see what we can do about Kimi Antonelli now. See if I can catch him. And he did quite well. I mean, Kimi was backing off towards the end and he didn't pass Kimi, but he got pretty close to him, got within about a second at the end of the race. But then the whole Marx Brothers thing continued because then Lewis's engineer, Lewis obviously at this point is absolutely furious. And they say to Lewis, oh, Lewis, Carlos Sainz is only 4.2 seconds behind you in the Williams. And of course he can see a little bit of blue in his mirrors anyway. So Lewis gets back on the radio, says, okay, do you want me to let him past as well? So it went on. I mean, need I say more? And bear in mind, this is Carlos Sainz as well. Think about the irony of all this. Alex Albon long gone, destroyed both Ferraris. Williams beat Ferrari, easy. But Carlos Sainz wasn't far away either. Catching them big time, catching Lewis big time. And this is the guy that basically was fired and he was replaced by Lewis. And here he is catching both Ferraris and already Williams are giving them a hard time. So it was all quite nerve-wracking. And then going into the last corner, well, it wasn't the last corner. At the end of the long back straight on the last lap, Carlos is in DRS behind Lewis. And Carlos has the run, has the momentum, goes down the inside of Lewis. And Lewis just goes straight across and they touch like this, bang, bang, bang. It looked like some sort of, B-rated Hollywood movie. And they go like this, and eventually Lewis just sort of staggers across the line ahead of Carlos Sainz. And Carlos on the slowdown lap with that deep voice of his says, I think Lewis moved quite a lot under braking. Understatement of the day there, Carlos. Just amazing stuff brought to life by the radio. So let's just go through the results because it's probably a bit all over the place, this video, because it was that sort of race. Lots going on. No actual safety car interventions, just all virtual safety car stuff. So that was probably a good thing, I guess. So Oscar Piastri, Lando Norris finished 33 seconds ahead of the opposition. I mean, and they didn't lead from the start. They were held up quite a lot by Max, and in Lando's case, he had to pass 3 or 4 cars, and they still beat the opposition by 33 seconds. Lando set fastest lap. Oscar Piastri dominated the race for yet another win. 3rd win for McLaren this year. I mean, it's looking a bit ridiculous, isn't it? It's just unbelievable how well he's driving and how well he's doing. Then 33 seconds behind, George Russell beat Max Verstappen by about 2 seconds. Maybe there'll be some sort of penalty. Unlikely, I suspect, but maybe there will be. And then 8 seconds behind them, a brilliant Alex Albon in the Williams-Mercedes. Pretty much forgotten by the TV cameras and the director because he was doing such a good job and he had that space either side of him. Really, really good driver, Alex Albon. Ahead of Kimi Antonelli, who just beat Charles Leclerc, who just beat Lewis Hamilton, who just beat Carlos Sainz. And that was, of course, where the TV was focused. And it was all quite good stuff. That was Ferrari, Williams, as I said. So yeah, an amazing day at the races. And I think, the sad thing is I've been saying this for so long now that what we really want to see is all the stuff that happens when they get out of the car and if they've done all the interviews or whatever, and then they get into the team briefing room. I would love to be in the Ferrari one when Charles and Lewis are there talking to the engineers, talking to the top brass about how that race went. And the ridiculous thing is, all the discussion will be about, oh, you did this and you kept me out there for I should have passed him there. Of course, it was all meaningless because the reality is the cars were absolutely terrible anyway, and they looked terrible. So forget Miami Ferrari. It was just a weekend to forget. But in our case, we won't forget it because we'll be doing some live streams and some cam chat very soon, no doubt. So big thank you to Jetcraft, to OEM Exclusive and to Track Ninja, and of course to RAC Watches, the newest of our partners, a brilliant new Danish company that combines pin-sharp technology with a genuine love of motor racing heritage. You can buy one of the GT40 watches, all of which contain materials from the original cars raced in the 1960s from the Shelby American, Essex Wire and Sid Taylor racing teams by following the link in the description below this video. And there's also a 20% discount you can claim if you use the code PETERGT40. So that was the Miami weekend. Thanks for joining us. As I say, lots of chat coming up. Take care. See you soon.